we have like 3 weeks left in this series, and then I'm going to be starting a brand new series. And I'll say more about that later. But we have this week and next week, and then remember we're taking off Memorial Day, right? And then we have 1 week after that, and we'll be wrapping up this series. But I want to thank you guys for sticking with it. And we're calling the series "Living the Dream." And what we've learned in this series is that every person has a dream from God, a calling and a dream. And the calling is God gives you an idea what he wants you to do with your life, and then one day you actually get to move into that. But a better way to think of it is this: God has a calling for your life, and he has a purpose for your life. And you may not know what that purpose is, but I'm telling you, God has a purpose for your life. There's something that God's called you to do, designed you to do, that no one else can do. I can't do it for you. No one else can do it for you. Only you can do that. But before we can experience the calling and begin that process of moving into the purpose of why God created us and put us on this planet, we're learning that we have to pass a number of tests. And these tests have to do with our character, because we've talked about the fact that our character has to be able to support the purpose that God has for us. And we're going to fail these tests. But here's the good thing about God. From God's perspective, we never really fail them. We just get a retake. But if we want to move into our purpose, we're going to keep taking the same test over and over until we figure out how to pass it. But once we do pass it, see, we get to experience the abundant life that God has for each one of us. It's the life that Jesus talked about in John chapter 10 when he said, I came that you might have life and have it to the full, or I came that you might have life and have it abundantly. And we're basing this series on the life of Joseph, and we're learning that Joseph had to go through a lot of the very same tests that we have to go through. It began with he had to go through the pride test. In other words, once you realize God has something for your life and you get that dream or you get that calling, how do you handle it? Does it go to your head? Does he exhibit pride? And we saw that Joseph had a hard time with this. He taunted his parents and his brothers about, hey, you're going to bow down to me one day. And so it didn't go very well. And then he was in the pit test, okay? And then after that came the prosperity test. And now the perseverance test last week. We talked about this is how God actually builds character in our life through taking us through times where we have to learn to persevere. And often it's when we find ourselves in a situation that we don't deserve to be in. And we saw that in the life of Joseph. But how do we handle those times? Now, this week we're going to be talking about the humility test. And here's the question I want us to think through. How do you respond when you are placed into when you go into a place of power and authority? You move into that spot. All of a sudden you have power and you have authority, you have influence. I know what a lot of you are thinking. You're thinking, well, I don't have to worry about this test because I will never have power or authority. But here's the reality. Think of it this way. Responsibility is not, if you have responsibility, any kind of responsibility, you then have power and authority. It can be very, very simple. If you're a parent, you may not see it this way, but as a parent, you have power and authority. You may be coaching your your kid's little league team. You may not realize it, but in that position, you have influence. You have power and authority. It may be you get a promotion at work, and you're like, well, it's not going to go to my head. Well, we'll see, because when you move into that role, you're going to have power and authority. If you're on your HOA board, the Homeowner Association board, you have power and authority, and I just want to tell you straightforward, you abuse it. But anyway, you have power and authority. So whenever you have responsibility, whenever you have, like, I have a deck that's like 3 feet by 10 feet. I've got to get an act of Congress to restain my deck, okay? That's what happens in a homeowner association, because there's a little bit of responsibility, and it goes to people. How many times have you said they must not have any responsibility anywhere else in life, right? Because it goes to people's heads. So we're going to see this in the life of Joseph. How did he deal with it when he got the power and he got the authority? Now, I'm going to read quite a lengthy story to you out of Genesis, because I want you to picture the whole thing that's going on, and I didn't want to just tell it to you. I want to read it to you. So we're going to pick up the story in Genesis chapter 41, but understand what's going on. Joseph is one of 12 brothers. He's his daddy's favorite. His dad gave him the coat of many colors. The brothers resented him. Then on top of that, Joseph had these dreams that one day you're going to bow down to me. They resented him even more. So eventually they decide not to kill Joseph, but put him into a pit and sell him into slavery. And so they sold him to some Ishmaelites who took Joseph to Egypt, where Egypt was purchased by a guy named Potiphar for 20 shekels of silver, and he became a slave. He became a servant in Potiphar's household. But Potiphar was so impressed with Joseph because he realized that God blessed Joseph, prospered Joseph in everything he did. In fact, Potiphar realized my household is a better place because Joseph is here. So he approaches Joseph and he says, you're just going to run everything. Have at it. And so Joseph, he's running Potiphar's household. And then one day we saw last week, Mrs. Potiphar busted a move on Joseph, and he rejected her, and he ran away, but she grabbed his coat, and then she said, oh, he tried to attack me. And of course, it got Joseph thrown into prison. And he was in prison for 11 years. But while he was in prison, the warden was so impressed with Joseph, he said, you know what? I'm going to let you run the prison. So everywhere Joseph went, he was put in charge. He had power and he had authority. About the 11th year that he was in prison, Pharaoh got upset with a couple of his workers. One was the cupbearer, one was the baker, and he threw them in prison. And guess what? They are under Joseph because Joseph's running the prison. And one day they wake up and they've had a dream and they're disturbed. And Joseph interprets their dream, and he tells the baker, it's not going to end well with you. You're going to get your head chopped off. But as for you, the cupbearer, you're going to get restored in 3 days back into your position. And sure enough, it happened. And he says, listen, when you get restored, don't forget me. Put in a good word with me for the Pharaoh. Get me out of this place. But the cupbearer forgot. So that was at 11 years. Okay, look what it says in Genesis chapter 41, verse 1. When 2 full years have passed, now Joseph has been in prison for 13 years for something he didn't do. When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside on the riverbank. The cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up and probably thought, no more pepperoni pizza right before I go to bed, right? He fell asleep again, had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. In the morning his mind was troubled, so he sent for all the magicians and the wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, today I am reminded of my shortcomings. And so the cupbearer thinks, oh yeah, there was a guy when I was in prison who interpreted my dream and I dropped the ball. I was supposed to tell you about it. I didn't tell you about it. And so he says, and Pharaoh was once angry with his servants. In other words, I could have told you this, but I forgot about it. And he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night. Each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captive of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. And things turned out exactly as he had interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was impaled. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. And when he comes before Pharaoh, Pharaoh tells his dreams to Joseph, and Joseph says, yeah, I can interpret those dreams. So if we drop down to verse 25, then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterwards are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh, God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming through the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow. Then all the abundance of Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered because the famine that follows is going to be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. In other words, 20%. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. The food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by famine. The plan seemed good to Pharaoh, and so he calls all of his officials. In other words, they like what they hear. Verse 38, so Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? Now, this is what's interesting. Pharaoh is not a believer. He's an unbeliever, but he recognizes that Joseph has the Spirit of God on his life. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, by the way, would your employer recognize that about you? That there's something different about you. And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace. All my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. Now understand, this is the humility test. Why is it a humility test? Well, let me put it in perspective. Joseph woke up one morning in prison. That night, he went to sleep in the palace. Not only that, he's now 30 years old. Now he's stepping in to his purpose. He has gone from being a prisoner for the last 13 years to being the second most powerful individual in the most powerful nation on the earth at that time. That's quite a step. So he's been given lots of power and lots of authority. Here's the question. How is he going to respond? Let me ask you a question. How would you respond if you went to work tomorrow or something happened in your life and all of a sudden you were catapulted to an area of leadership or prominence that you never had expected to be in? How would you handle it? Now you have all this authority and all of this power. And as I said earlier, one day you're going to be given power and authority to fulfill whatever purpose it is that God has for your life. Now, let me just tell you, it is going to be a huge test. In fact, I'll warn you ahead of time. It may be the hardest test for you to pass. When all of a sudden, you've got everything that you thought you deserved, everything that you dreamed possible. Now, I think we probably have all seen this play out in our lives. We probably have all worked somewhere where we had a coworker and they got promoted and they're like, oh, this isn't going to change me, and it immediately changed them. You know what I'm talking about? I've seen it in ministry for years and years ago, when just a little church. I led a lady in my office. I led her to Christ. I'll never forget that. She accepted Jesus as her Savior. She was divorced. She was very popular and very successful in the marketplace. But boy, she hit the ground running, and she wanted to make a difference. And she loved how people welcomed her when she came to the church. So she decided, I'm going to make sure everybody feels welcome. Well, we were only about 100 people at the most at that time, but she went out of her way, and she would hand out bulletins. You guys, some of you don't know what bulletins are, but they're right up there with newspapers. There used to be these paper things that you'd read, and it would tell you what's going on in church and all the announcements. She would make sure everybody got a bulletin. She would make sure she would introduce them to someone so they would have someone to sit with them that week. She went out of her. She loved Jesus and she loved people. Well, years later, we were a bigger church. And I thought, finally, we got to put someone in a position on staff to run this thing, right? And I asked her, and she said, oh, I'm so humbled that you would even ask. And she left her very, very successful job in the marketplace to go to work for the church. And man, I have never seen such a transformation in my life. I mean, she was in charge of people saying hi to people and giving out bulletins. And she made them go to training and seminars and conferences, right? I used to call her Little Hitler. And I didn't tell her that, but I used to call her Little Hitler. I'd never seen it in my life. And if you didn't show up on time and check in, you couldn't serve at your post today. Again, all you had to do is show up and smile and give somebody a bulletin, right? But I mean, it totally, my point is this. She didn't pass the humility test, okay? She got put in that position and she couldn't have it. So I want to talk about that this week, and I have two questions that we're going to have to work through. And if we can work through these questions, they're going to help us pass the humility test when this opportunity comes, when we have the power, the influence, and the authority. Here's the first question we have to keep in perspective. Where does power come from? And obviously the answer is it comes from God. But let me show you a couple of verses. Psalm 62 verse 11 says this: one thing God has spoken, two things I have heard, power belongs to God. Any questions whatsoever? I mean, it's very, very clear that all power comes from God. John 19. This, by the way, this is one, I think, the funniest scenes in the Bible. Okay, Jesus is before Pilate. This is what Pilate says. Do you refuse to speak to me, Pilate said. We just went through this study, and remember, he would ask Jesus questions, and Jesus would just remain silent. And then Pilate said this: don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you? Now, let me just remind you. He's talking to the Son of God. He's talking to the person who literally created the heavens and the earth and the universe. But I want you to notice how Jesus responded. In verse 11, Jesus answered, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. So again, all power comes from God. Now, that means that we have to recognize even though we may be gifted, and even though we may be talented, and even though we may work really, really hard and we get really, really good results, it's only because God has given us the power to do that. It's only because God has given us the health to do that, the mind to do that. It's only because God has blessed us. Years ago, I had a young man that started out in student ministries, and he was going to seminary, and he finally graduated from seminary. And so, I tried to reward him a little bit, and we would have staff meetings every Tuesday, and I would find someone who didn't normally get to be in the spotlight. And so he had just graduated from seminary, so I thought I would reward him, and I saw him, and I said, hey, listen, we have communion tomorrow. Would you like to give a little devotional in staff meeting and set up communion? And he said, oh, I'd be so honored to do that. And I said, okay. I said, you want to go over anything? He said, I got it. I said, okay. Well, the next day he led. He didn't got it. He didn't have it at all. But I was in my office later on working, and he came and stuck his head in, and he says, how do you think I did today? And I'm a nice guy. I said, man, you did a great job. And he said, it was all God. And I'm like, it wasn't that good. It wasn't that good. My point is, he didn't pass the humility test. It had immediately gone to his head. It's kind of like the farmer who says this, I get up early every day. I go to bed late every night. I work the land. I plow. I plant. When it's harvest time, I harvested. It's incredible. But in the back of my mind, this is what I know. It's God that sends the rain. It's God that allows the sun to shine. And it's God that allows the plants and the crops to grow. Somewhere in there, you have to find that balance. I may be blessed by God. I may have spiritual gifts. I may work really, really hard. But as Paul said, it's God that gives the increase. Without God, we're basically nothing. He gives us the power and the authority to be successful. This is something else you need to know about power. There is actually a God-given righteous desire for power. I mean, think about it. God is omnipotent, which means that God is all-powerful. So power isn't bad. It's not bad. God represents power. And let's take it a step further. Each one of us is created in the image of God. So it shouldn't be a shock to us that there's something inside of us that we naturally desire power. Sometimes it gets skewed. Sometimes it comes across as manipulation. Sometimes it comes across as control. But there's something inside of us that we all kind of like power. We like authority. And here's the thing I want you to understand. In itself, power isn't bad. The problem comes with how we decide to use that power. When I was growing up, there was a show on TV that I absolutely loved. I don't think I ever missed it. It was called Bonanza. Anybody remember Bonanza? My mom and dad are 95 and 92. Most times when I go to visit them, Bonanza is still playing. It's still rock solid, right? But it's about the family. They're known as the Cartwrights. And he's a single father, and he has these 3 boys, and they're really cool. They're all just wonderful people. But you got to love Ben Cartwright, this father, because he has all this power, all this authority, and all of this influence, but he never ever abused it. He only used it to help people. And it seemed like in every episode there was an underdog, right? Somebody was trying to steal their land, push them off their land. Somebody was stealing their cattle. And Ben Cartwright, he would always come to the aid of the underdog and save them. He had a lot of power, but he only used it for good. It's good power. He used it to help people. But my point is this. Every one of us, deep down inside, if we're honest, we have a desire for power. I want you to know that's not a bad thing. Jesus said this in Mark chapter 9, verse 35. If anyone wants to be first, he didn't say it was wrong to be first, did he? He said if anybody wants to be first. Now, what would that indicate? You're going to have power and authority. If anyone wants to be first, he must be the last. He must be the last, and he must be the servant of all. Jesus once warned the disciples. He said, hey, out in the Gentile world, this is how they handle it. They love to have authority and power. They love to lord it over people. What did he say to disciples? Not so among you. So it's not the power is the problem. It's how do you use the power. Let me show you another one. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1. Maybe you've never thought about it this way. Paul says, whoever aspires to be an overseer. In other words, whoever desires to be a minister, a pastor, an elder. In other words, if that individual desires that, Paul says he desires a noble task. And so if a person says, I would love to be in the role of a minister, I would love to be in the role of an elder in a church, because I want to be in a position where I can help people. That's good power. So there's nothing wrong with desiring power and influence if it's for the right reason. By the way, if you still don't believe that we're born with an innate desire for power, have a kid and get a dog. That kid will have no power over anything, but he'll have power over that dog. Have you ever seen that? It's true. Aaron was a little boy, he's like 2 years old, made the biggest mistake. I had some nightmare dogs. I had some mental issues, emotional issues. I would rescue them and I'd take them back and they wouldn't take them back. And I'm like, wait a minute, that's a bait and switch, right? And I give at least one because I couldn't stand it. And so I had a dog. The only dog I ever liked was a Siberian Husky. And if anything came into our yard, that was dead. I love that guy. I used to put cat food out. No, I didn't do it. But anyway, I didn't have a good time with dogs. I had a good time with dogs. But this dog would, every time Aaron would walk out, I don't care how we tried to train it, the dog would jump all over. So I gave Aaron a wiffle ball bat. And I said, what you do is if the dog comes up, you just tap him on the nose with a wiffle ball bat. I went out there one day and the dog's laying under a bush and he's beating that dog with the wiffle bat. I'm like, okay, that's an abuse of power, right? So we all have, by the way, since I'm talking about dogs and cat, I got a weird situation. I need you to pray about my neighborhood. I think there's a black cat that was roaming the neighborhood. And one time it was even in my garage. I left the garage door open. And always running around. And so the lady next door came out one day and I said, the black cat went by. I said, do you know who's that black cat belongs to? And she said, well, it's, what was the word she used? It's an interesting situation. I'm like, who the cat belongs to? It's an interesting situation. I was like, okay. And I never got an answer. Okay. One day, Shannon and I are looking out the window, and there's like an alley behind us where you can come in and park. She's walking the cat on a leash. Now, the cat got off the alley and laid down in the grass. And she just stood there while the cat laid in the grass. Till finally the cat got up. I watched this whole thing go down, okay? The cat got up and walked about 10 steps in the middle and just laid down in the middle of the alleyway. She sat down on the ground in the middle of the street with the leash waiting for the cat to get back up. I'm thinking she thinks that's her grandmother or something. There's something going on weird with that cat, but please pray about that whole situation. We got to get it resolved. But anyway, all that to say, there is a desire for power as long as it's to help people. Let me show you a couple of more verses. Acts 10, verse 38. How God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and power, and how he went around doing good and healing all who were under the power of the devil because God was with him. Power is good. Deuteronomy 8, verse 17. You may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability, it's the same word as power in the Hebrew, to produce wealth, so confirms his covenant, which he swore to your ancestors as it is today. In other words, what it's saying there, if you have been blessed financially, it's because God has given you the power to be successful financially. But he did it for one reason. According to this verse, it's so that he can establish his covenant on the earth. Let me say it another way. Bring his kingdom to this earth. So again, that's the only reason that God shares his power is so that we can help people. Now, do you know what that means? It means that God is looking for distributors of his power. He's looking for people that he can entrust power to. And I'm telling you what, it's a test. He wants to see what you're going to do with it. The world says power is for self. If you don't believe that, just check out pretty much the political system. Jacques, you're excluded because we're running for president and vice president, right? But the Bible says no. If God puts you in a position of authority and power, it's to help people. It's to help people. Second, who does God give power to? He gives power to the humble. Let me show you a couple of verses. James 4:10, humble yourselves before the Lord and he will lift you up. He will lift you up. Let me say it another way. God will give you power and authority. He will give you influence if you're humble. Here's another one. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 5 and 6. In the same way, you who are younger, submit yourself to your elders. All of you, clothe yourself with humility toward one another because God opposes the proud but gives favor to the humble. I'm going to come back to that word favor. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand that he may lift you up, literally give you power in due time. This is what's interesting. The Greek word that's translated favor here, God opposes the proud but shows favor to the humble. That word favor is the exact same Greek word that's translated grace throughout the New Testament. We know that. What is the definition of grace? Unmerited what? Unmerited favor. But you may not know this. Another definition for grace, it's kind of weird, is enablement. Enablement. At the root of the word enablement is the word power. In other words, what Paul is saying is this: grace gives you the power to overcome sin in your life that otherwise you would never have the power to overcome. It enables you to do that. So understand, God gives grace to the humble. Or say it another way, God gives power to the humble. And it comes as a result of humility. By the way, have you ever met someone who is just incredibly successful? And you're just honored to be in their presence, but at the same time, they're incredibly humble. How do you feel when you walk away from a person like that? There's just something about their spirit that just attracts you to them. They have all this power, all this authority, but yet there's still this gentleness, this humbleness. But have you ever been around someone who honestly never accomplished anything in their life, but they think they have? And they're full of pride? And there's a sense of entitlement? How does it make you feel? It just nauseates you. But when you want to think about somebody who has all power yet the perfect balance of humility, who do you think about? You think about Jesus. I mean, Jesus, there's only one place in the Bible where Jesus talked about himself, where he said, you want to know what I'm like? This is what I'm like. Matthew chapter 11, verse 29, he said this. He said, I am gentle and I'm humble. If you want to know from me what I'm like, that's what I am. I'm gentle and I'm humble. And you know what? One of the perfect places you see this is in the great story in John chapter 13, where here we have the Son of God, God in the flesh, in the upper room with the disciples the night before the crucifixion. And according to Luke 22, you know what the disciples are talking about? Jesus is trying to get them prepared that he's getting ready to go to the cross, right? You know what they're talking about? Who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom? Who's going to sit on the right hand? Who's going to sit on the left hand? My mom, I promised my mom I would sit on the right hand. I mean, chicken bones are probably flying back. I mean, it's an all-out war going on. And Jesus doesn't say anything. What does he do? He gets up, he takes off his outer garment, he gets a towel, he gets a basin of water, and he decides he's going to wash the disciples' feet. I want to give you 4 characteristics of humility to think about as we wrap it up this weekend, right from the life of Jesus. Here's the first one. Humility doesn't need to be announced. Jesus hears all this argument. He knows what they're talking about. He knows what their concern is. They still thought Jesus was going to set up an earthly kingdom, overthrow Rome. They were going to sit in his cabinet. They were going to have these powerful positions of authority. And they're arguing back and forth, and Jesus quietly gets up, and he doesn't say, I am now going to demonstrate humility by washing your feet. He doesn't do that. It doesn't need to be announced. Let me tell you something. If you're ever around someone and every time they talk, they say, they want to remind you how humble they are, you know, or I'm just a humble servant. That's not a sign of humility. That's a sign of pride. Jesus didn't say anything. He just got up and he started washing their feet. So humility, it doesn't need to be announced. It's more about what we are and how we carry ourselves and what we do than it is about what we say. I can assure you that when Jesus started washing the disciples' feet, the message was loud and clear. I'm sure they were thinking, here we are arguing about who's the greatest. And by the way, the custom in that day was when someone came to your place for a party, dinner, house, whatever, everybody removed their shoes. They had been walking through the dirty streets of Jerusalem. Often they were muddy. They were filled with animal dung and everything else. And so you washed everyone's feet. Normally you had a servant to do it. If it wasn't the servant, it was the first guest to arrive who took the role of washing the feet. All those disciples showed up. Do you think any of them took the role of washing the feet? No, they're too worried about who's going to sit on his right and his left. So Jesus says, so they knew exactly what was going on. They knew what was coming. See, they know the Son of God is going to wash our feet. They're not dumb. Which brings you to verse 5. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. By the way, just imagine this scene with the disciples. Here they're arguing, spit flying all over the place, food flying across the table. They hear splashing water. Like, oh, man. And here comes Jesus to wash their feet. They're probably like, great. And maybe he started with John and worked his way around to Andrew and Matthew, and you're sitting there, right? You're next. And see, that's a little threatening because you're right there exhibiting your pride, and here's the Son of God getting ready to wash your feet. But here's the thing, though. You know your feet are dirty. And here's Jesus getting ready to wash your feet. No doubt about the fact your feet are dirty, but you also know that there's other stuff going on in your life beneath the surface, not just dirty feet. And God is humbling himself enough to wash your feet. When you study the life of Jesus, it's interesting that you discover that he spent most of his time meeting needs, not that were on the surface, but meeting needs that were beneath the surface. You see it with the woman at the well. He really wasn't concerned about how many times she had been married. He wanted to know, let's get to the root of the issue. What's really going on in your heart? How about Peter after he denied Jesus and Jesus finally set up the little fire on the shore after the resurrection, and when Peter recognized it was Jesus, he swam to the shore. Jesus didn't wear him out about what kind of friend are you? You said you would die for me, and here you are denying me. He said, no. Let's talk about what's going on beneath the surface. Let's talk about the real issue. He said, Peter, do you love me? Because that's the real issue. And so you find that through the ministry. He was dealing with the needs that were beneath the surface, what was really, really going on. And I'm going to be honest with you. I think one of probably, for me, the most, I don't want to say frustrating, disheartening things about a ministry like this is that we're not really getting the opportunity to get below the surface in our relationships about what's really going on. Lots of weekends I leave here and I think, man, we had a great time. There was a good group of people here. But I really wonder, are our needs really getting met? Because sometimes I get a chance to talk to you or cross paths with you, and often I feel maybe there's something going on in your life that you don't feel comfortable discussing. You may not even know how to discuss it. But I know it's there. You can just kind of sense it's there. And one of my big frustrations is that I just don't personally have the time to meet everybody's needs. But I'll tell you this, no pastor does. No pastor does. Nobody's superhuman like that. And it's one of the reasons, Lisa, just wave your hand. Lisa has been trained for years in Stephen's ministry, and I've asked her to head that up for us here at Be Renewed. And what she's going to help us do is learn what Stephen's ministry is. How can we as just common people learn to listen and address the needs of one another as friends, right? Because I've always said what people need more than a counselor usually is just a good friend with some biblical truth who can say, I can help you with this. And my prayer is simply this, that God's going to raise up people here that will hear more than words, people who can communicate a level of acceptance and love that goes beneath what's being seen, but will address what's really going on beneath the surface. Because I'll tell you, the real need in our relationships today is not connecting more effectively on social media. It's being able to sit down with somebody and say, man, I'm picking up on something. What's really going on? All right, something's not right. Is there some way I can help you? But we have to get to the point where we're able to address more than what's just going on the surface. Jesus had the ability to do that. And we got to figure out, how do we do that? Here's the second characteristic, and this is why it's hard for us to do that. Humility is as comfortable receiving as giving. Lots of times we don't open up because we want to be the person helping. We don't necessarily want to be the person being helped. It says in verse 6 of John 13, he came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? At first that looks like humility. Whoa, you're the Son of God. You're not touching my feet. It's not humility. It's pride. See, he's not comfortable receiving what Jesus wants to do for him. But humility is as comfortable receiving as giving. Let's be honest. It takes a lot of humility to receive a gesture that somebody tries to do for you, a kind deed. Jesus said it's more blessed to give than receive. I will tell you this, it's more difficult to receive than it is to give. I like to think I'm a pretty capable person, can take care of myself. I'll never forget, this was years ago, it was Pastor Appreciation Month, which is something I think Hallmark, just must be some way Hallmark makes some money. But anyway, I look out my door one day, and there's a guy that I led to Christ, and he's unloading his pickup truck with a power washer. I'm like, What are you doing here? I'm going to power wash your house. I don't think so. And yeah, I am. It's Pastor Appreciation Month. I just want you to know I appreciate you and love you. I'm going to power wash your house. I'm going to pay you. How much will you take? You ain't paying me anything. I want to do this for you. It's something I can do for you. And I'm like, oh, let me go put some old clothes on. I'll come out and help you. He says, no, you're not helping me either. I'm going to do it for you. It drove me nuts. I felt like I owed him something. He came back the next year. I look, he's unloading his truck, an aerator. He's going to aerate my lawn. I mean, you got to go. You got to go. But the thing is, I like to be the guy going and doing something and helping people. It's easy to do that. It takes real humility to accept something from people. Let me ask you a question. Have you recently gone through something and you thought you had it covered up pretty well, but it was obvious to somebody who really knew you, and they came alongside of you and said, you're not going to walk through this by yourself? That's humbling, isn't it? Like, wow, you picked up on it. This whole thing was threatening to Peter, you know. And Peter's like, yeah, he ain't washing my feet. Not these feet. Matthew, yeah. Zebedee, Andrew, not only wash him, the Lord give him a pedicure. That guy's feet's ridiculous, right? But you're not touching my feet. That's pride. We act like we don't have needs. I don't know why we do that. I don't know why it's so hard for us just to admit. We're screw-ups, people. We're all big screw-ups. We all have problems and issues. I used to resent families that looked like they had it all together. Their kids were perfect, dressed perfect, all the social media pictures. And then you get to discover a little bit. You know how you know? Because you got kids who know their kids. It's like, oh, that's a facade, right? I was, some reason I was doing something this weekend. Somebody's name, they're not here today, so don't try to figure out who it is, popped into my head. And I just thought, oh man, he's going through a lot. So I just texted him, I said, how you doing? This is a response to that. I'm getting by. I'm meeting my obligations and responsibility, but joy is tough to come by right now. Now let's be honest. How many of us would be honest enough to say that? If you really want to know, I'm getting by, right? Most of us, fine. Right. This is something I read years ago. Fellowship in the early church grew out of a shared problems and a sense of responsibility to meet each other's needs. In many religious circles today, Christians know little about each other's personal needs, and they feel little responsibility even when they do. People sit side by side in church week after week and seldom get acquainted with each other. What happens when it is known that a Christian is facing a crucial decision, a temptation, criticism, unemployment, illness, loneliness, rebellion in his children? Among some believers, sometimes there is an instant rallying and loving concern, but more often than not, nothing happens. See? How much better it would have been if Peter would have said, Jesus, thank you. I got real needs. My feet, that's the least of them. That's the least of them. Here's a third characteristic of humility. Humility is the mark of a strength, not weakness. It's a mark of strength, not weakness. I think a lot of us think if you're humble and gentle, people are going to walk all over you. You're going to be a doormat taken advantage of. But look what it says, verse 8. No, said Peter, you shall never wash my feet. Look how strong Jesus was. Unless I wash your feet, you have no part of me. It's that simple. It's your choice, right? And Peter's response, typical Peter, verse 9. Oh, Lord, Simon Peter said, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well. You know, don't stop at my feet. Give me a bath. Get the loofah out. Let's do it right if we're going to do it right. But he went too far. Jesus answered him in verse 10. Those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean. In other words, he's saying, hey, we're okay, Peter. You're already clean throughout. But there's some areas in your life. Maybe there's some cleaning up that needs to take place. There's some sponging off that needs to take place. There's some areas of confession you need to deal with. But even though Jesus was humble, his response exhibited strength. And here's the fourth one. Fourth characteristic. Humility must be expressed before joy can come. Before joy can come. It says in John 13, verse 15, Jesus, I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Do what? Exhibited humility and servanthood. Verse 17, now that you know these things, again, you will be blessed if you do them. Humility is not something you learn in a class or a Bible study or a small group. This is something you develop by living it out in every area of your life. And it's a big test. It's a big test. I had a profound thought this week. I get one about every 4 or 5 years. But I was working through this in next week's lesson. There are only 2 things on this earth that are eternal. God's word. Heaven and earth shall pass away. My word will never pass away. The second one is people. God's word's eternal and people are eternal. And that basically means that if I take that seriously, any spare moment I can invest in God's word is going to bring eternal dividends. And anytime I can invest in people is going to bring eternal dividends. Now, we've talked about God's word. We talked the other week about hearing it. Let me ask you a question. How much time did you spend, just go through your mind this week, how much time did you spend with people this week? Not just because it's where you worked, not because if I'm nice to them, it's a chance for me to get ahead. It may benefit me somehow, not for I'm just having fun. How much time did you actually spend with people, maybe a person this week, about something that was going on in their life with the simple intention of, maybe there's something I can do to help? I had to run back through my mind on that one. Like, forget me right now. I sense something's going on. How can I help you? It's interesting, Galatians chapter 6, verse 1, when it says if someone's caught in a sin, that's just an example, but basically someone's going through a tough time. He says, restore them. The word restore means you get up under and say, how can I carry this with you? Restore is not a 3-year program. Restore from a biblical perspective is, you got a burden. How do I help you get through it? Is there anybody you can think of this week? I would just challenge you. Start paying a little bit more attention about what's going on around you. You know what? Sometimes we don't want to ask. How many times have you said, I want to ask them how they're doing, but I know what's going to happen. They're going to tell me. And you've walked away. Suppose you're the only person that's going to ask. See? It has a lot to do with whether you're prideful or humble. If you're prideful, you won't take the time because you know what? You're just too dang important. If you're humble, you'll find the time. I don't care how inconvenient it is, and I tell you what, sometimes it's going to be messy, and sometimes you're going to get your hands dirty, and sometimes we avoid it because you know what? We know we may have to step up and do something to actually help them. But because we're so much more important, that's not important to us. So understand, it's going to determine whether or not you're humble. It's also going to determine whether or not God can trust you with power, because he gives it to people who are humble. I'm going to give you an assignment today on Mother's Day. You cannot leave today without finding somebody you don't know and at least introducing yourself to them. You don't know me? I'm so-and-so. I just want to meet you. But we got to start breaking down these barriers. I told Shannon one of the things that's so hard for me after the second session, by the time I say amen and go over here to turn the sound system off, gone. Everybody's gone. Parking lot's empty, trying to beat the Methodists to the Golden Corral, whatever it is. I don't know. It's just like the rapture took place. When I turned, boom, they're gone, right? It may take us 3 minutes. But let's just get in the habit of, I see somebody I don't know. That's just, isn't that the way life used to be before we got garages? And they went in, we put in, we never had to see it. I got neighbors I haven't seen. I saw one the other day. I was shocked he was white. I'm like, I didn't even know he was white. That's how little I know about my neighbors. I'm like, I didn't know if he was Indian. I didn't know if he was African. He's white. I got a white neighbor, you know, which is rare because most of my neighbors are Indians. But anyway, so I'm just saying, that's how little time we'll take, you know. And so I would think here at a place like this where we are the family of God, maybe we could just take a second and say, I've seen you for a few weeks. I just want you to know I'm Mike. Just glad to meet you this morning. Hey, I hope you have a great day. Wouldn't that be a great, and then next week you got somebody to say hi to. But if we could just get there, I think it would start to show some humility in our lives. Any questions this morning? Any feedback?